The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse with a peculiar coldness, casting long shadows across the marble floors that seemed to echo the emptiness within Evelyn's chest. She stood motionless before the vast expanse of glass, her reflection a pale spectre against the bustling city below, watching as Manhattan awakened to another day of endless possibility, possibilities that felt as distant to her as the stars themselves. 4 years. 4 long years since she had spoken the words "I do" in a ceremony that had been more spectacle than sacrament, more business transaction than union of hearts. The memory of that day came to her now, with the bitter clarity that only hindsight could provide. The hundreds of guests who had whispered behind gloved hands about the unusual match, the photographers who had captured every staged smile, every carefully orchestrated moment that had proclaimed to the world that Evelyn Montgomery had married Alexander Thorne, one of the most powerful and enigmatic millionaires of their generation. Yet in all those years, through all the public appearances and charity galas, through the carefully maintained facade of marital bliss, he had never once touched her with anything resembling affection. Their interactions had been cordial, distant, professional even, as if she were merely another acquisition in his vast empire, a beautiful ornament to be displayed when necessary and ignored when not. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, the contrast between the warmth of her skin and the winter chill seeping through the window serving as a metaphor for her existence in this gilded cage. The city below pulsed with life, with passion, with all the human connections she had been denied. People hurried along the sidewalks with purpose, their faces animated by joy, anger, love. Any emotion seemed preferable to the numbness that had become her constant companion. "Mrs. Thorne," came the soft voice of Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper who had served the Thorne family for decades and who treated Evelyn with a kindness that often felt like the only warmth in her life. "Mr. Thorne has left for the office. He said he wouldn't be home for dinner again tonight." Evelyn didn't turn from the window. She had learned not to expect him for dinner, just as she had learned not to expect him for breakfast, or for any meal for that matter. His absence had become as predictable as the sunrise, and perhaps more welcome. At least when he wasn't there, she didn't have to endure the suffocating politeness that marked their every interaction, the careful way he avoided even the most casual physical contact, as if she were made of some material that might contaminate him. "Thank you, Mrs. Hartwell," she murmured, her breath creating a small cloud of condensation on the glass. "I think I'll take my breakfast in the library today." "Ah!" The older woman's expression softened with something that might have been pity, though she was far too well trained to let it show completely. "Of course, madam. Shall I have cook prepare your usual?" Evelyn nodded absently. Her usual had become as predictable as everything else in her life. Black coffee, a single piece of toast with marmalade, perhaps some fruit if she felt particularly ambitious about maintaining the pretense of appetite. Food had lost much of its appeal when every meal was consumed in solitude, when every bite seemed to echo in the vast dining room that could have seated 20, but never seemed to seat more than one. As Mrs. Hartwell's footsteps retreated down the hallway, Evelyn finally turned from the window and made her way to the library, the one room in the apartment that felt like it belonged to her, where Alexander rarely ventured, perhaps because the volumes of poetry and classic literature that lined the walls held no interest for a man whose entire existence seemed devoted to the acquisition of wealth and power. The library had become her sanctuary, a place where she could lose herself in the lives and loves of fictional characters who experienced the passion and connection that seemed so foreign to her own existence. Here, surrounded by the works of the Brontes, Austen and Dickens, she could pretend that such feelings were not merely the inventions of romantic minds, but real possibilities for real people, even if not for her. She settled into the leather armchair by the window, the one piece of furniture in the entire apartment that showed signs of actual use, its cushions molded to her form from countless hours of reading, of escaping into worlds where love conquered all. and where marriage was more than a legal document binding two strangers in mutual indifference. The morning newspaper lay folded on the side table, and she glanced at it with the same mixture of curiosity and dread that had become her morning ritual. The business section invariably contained some mention of Alexander's latest triumph: a merger completed, a rival company acquired, another few million added to his already incomprehensible fortune. The society pages often featured photographs from the various events they attended together, images of them standing side by side in perfect formal wear, smiling their perfect formal smiles, giving the world exactly what it expected to see from one of New York's most prominent couples. She had become quite skilled at that smile, she reflected with bitter irony. It was a smile that could be summoned on command, that could last through entire evenings of mindless chatter and champagne toasts, that never faltered even when some well-meaning acquaintance would comment on how fortunate she was to have captured the heart of such an eligible bachelor. If only they knew that capturing his heart would have required first finding evidence that he possessed one. The sound of her phone buzzing against the glass surface of the side table interrupted her brooding. A text message from her sister Caroline, who lived in California with her husband and two young children, a life that seemed to exist in an entirely different universe from Evelyn's own. "Missing you! When are you going to convince that husband of yours to take a vacation so you can visit? The kids keep asking about Aunt Evie." Evelyn stared at the message for a long moment before typing back a response that was as practiced as her public smile. "Soon, I hope. Things have been busy here." It was easier than explaining that Alexander had never shown the slightest interest in meeting her family, that their relationship existed in such a carefully contained sphere that the idea of integrating their lives in any meaningful way seemed as likely as finding water in a desert. Mrs. Hartwell appeared in the doorway with a silver tray bearing her breakfast, and Evelyn set the phone aside, grateful for the interruption. The housekeeper arranged the items with the precise care that marked everything in the Thorne household, then hesitated at the doorway as if wanting to say something. "Is there something else, Mrs. Hartwell?" The older woman's weathered hands fidgeted with her apron. "Forgive me for speaking out of turn, madam, but I've served this family for 30 years, and I've never seen Master Alexander so troubled." Evelyn looked up sharply. "Troubled? He barely sleeps, barely eats, spends most of his time in his study even when he's home, and sometimes I catch him looking—" She paused, seeming to search for the right words. "Looking at you when you're not aware of it, as if he wants to say something but can't find the words." The revelation sent an unexpected flutter through Evelyn's chest. Hope, perhaps, or merely the dying echo of a hope she had long since abandoned. "I'm sure you're mistaken, Mrs. Hartwell. Mr. Thorne has his business concerns, that's all." But even as she spoke the words, Evelyn found herself remembering moments that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now took on new meaning in light of Mrs. Hartwell's observation. The way she sometimes felt his gaze upon her during their rare shared meals, only to look up and find him studying his newspaper with apparent absorption. The morning she had found a first edition of Jane Eyre, her favorite novel, on her bedside table with no explanation, though she had never mentioned her love for the book to him. The way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly whenever other men spoke to her at social functions, a tension she had attributed to general displeasure with social obligations rather than anything resembling possessiveness or jealousy. Mrs. Hartwell nodded and withdrew, leaving Evelyn alone with her thoughts and her barely touched breakfast. The coffee grew cold as she sat in contemplation, her mind racing through 4 years of marriage, searching for signs she might have missed, for hints of feeling beneath the carefully maintained surface of their relationship. Had she been so absorbed in her own pain, her own sense of rejection and isolation, that she had failed to see that perhaps Alexander was equally trapped in this strange prison they had created together? The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. If Mrs. Hartwell was right, if there was something beneath his cool exterior, then perhaps there was still hope for them. But if she was wrong, if she allowed herself to believe in possibilities that didn't exist, the disappointment might finally break what little remained of her spirit. The day passed, as most of her days did, in solitude punctuated by brief interactions with the household staff, in reading that provided temporary escape from the questions that plagued her mind, in the careful maintenance of the image of contentment that she had perfected over the years. But Mrs. Hartwell's words had planted a seed of possibility that refused to be ignored. And by evening, Evelyn found herself in the unusual position of actually hoping that Alexander might come home. When the clock struck 9 and she heard the distinctive sound of his key in the lock, her heart began to beat with an intensity that surprised her. She remained in the library, not wanting to appear too eager, but every fiber of her being was attuned to the sound of his movements through the apartment. She heard him speak briefly to Mrs. Hartwell, heard his footsteps on the marble floor of the foyer, and then silence. Minutes passed. Then she heard his study door close with its characteristic soft click, and she knew that once again they would spend the evening in the same apartment, but in completely separate worlds. The disappointment was sharp and immediate, but it was accompanied by something she hadn't felt in years: determination. She had spent 4 years accepting the parameters of their strange marriage, 4 years telling herself that this was simply the way things were and would always be. But Mrs. Hartwell's observation had awakened something in her, a stubborn spark of hope that refused to be extinguished by one more evening of polite distance. If Alexander Thorne was indeed troubled, if he was looking at her with unspoken longing, as Mrs. Hartwell claimed, then perhaps it was time to find out what lay beneath the surface of their carefully orchestrated life. For the first time in their marriage, Evelyn began to contemplate the possibility of being the one to break the silence that had defined their relationship. The idea terrified her, but it also filled her with a sense of purpose she had almost forgotten she was capable of feeling. Tomorrow, she decided, watching the city lights twinkle like stars beyond her window, tomorrow she would begin to discover whether the man she had married was as unreachable as he appeared, or whether there was a heart beating beneath that perfectly pressed exterior, a heart that might, against all odds, be beating for her. As the night deepened around her, Evelyn found herself planning not just for tomorrow, but for the possibility of a future she had never dared to imagine. The morning would bring new possibilities, new chances to reach across the vast distance that separated them. For the first time in 4 years, she felt truly alive with anticipation rather than resignation. She had been patient long enough. It was time to discover what her husband was truly made of and what she herself was capable of when pushed beyond the boundaries of quiet acceptance. The thought both thrilled and terrified her, but at least it was better than the numbness that had been her constant companion. At least it was something that resembled hope. The morning brought with it a resolution that surprised Evelyn with its clarity and force. She had awakened before dawn, her mind sharp and focused in a way it hadn't been for months, perhaps years. The conversation with Mrs. Hartwell had acted like a key, turning in a lock she hadn't even realized existed, opening possibilities that had been sealed away behind years of careful resignation and practiced indifference. She chose her attire with unusual care, selecting a dress of deep emerald silk that she had worn only once before, to a charity gala where she had caught Alexander's eyes upon her more than once, though he had said nothing about her appearance then, just as he never did. The dress brought out the color of her eyes and complemented her auburn hair in ways that made her feel, for perhaps the first time in their marriage, deliberately beautiful rather than merely presentable. Alexander was already at the breakfast table when she entered the dining room, a sight so unusual that she paused momentarily in the doorway. In 4 years of marriage, she could count on one hand the number of mornings they had shared breakfast, and never had he been the one waiting for her. He sat with his characteristic perfect posture, his dark hair immaculately styled despite the early hour, his attention apparently absorbed by the financial reports spread before him. But there was something different about him this morning, a tension in his shoulders that spoke of sleepless nights and unquiet thoughts. "Good morning, Alexander," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that felt foreign after years of polite formality. He looked up, and for just a moment she saw something flicker across his features, surprise perhaps, or something deeper that vanished so quickly she might have imagined it. His dark eyes, which she had often thought were like winter mornings, seemed to take in every detail of her appearance before he composed himself into his usual mask of distant politeness. "Good morning, Evelyn." His voice was as controlled as always, but there was something in the way he spoke her name that was different, as if he were tasting it on his tongue and finding it unexpectedly sweet. "You look well this morning." It was perhaps the closest thing to a personal compliment he had offered her in their entire marriage, and she felt a flutter of something that might have been hope or might have been pure desperation. She took her usual seat across from him, close enough to see the way the morning light caught the silver threads at his temples. He was only 32, but the demands of his empire had marked him in small ways that somehow only added to his austere handsomeness. "I thought I might visit the Metropolitan Museum today," she said, pouring herself coffee with hands that trembled only slightly. "There's a new exhibition of pre-Raphaelite paintings. I wondered if you might—" She let the invitation hang in the air between them. A bridge tentatively extended across the chasm that had defined their relationship. Alexander's hand stilled on his coffee cup, and she watched as a series of emotions played across his face too quickly for her to interpret. For a moment, she thought he might actually accept, might for once step outside the rigid boundaries he had constructed around their life together. But then his expression closed, returning to the familiar mask of polite distance. "I'm afraid I have meetings all day, perhaps another time." The words were courteous enough, but they carried the same dismissive quality that had characterized all their interactions. Yet something in his tone, some small hesitation before he spoke, made her wonder if the refusal cost him something. "Mrs. Hartwell's words echoed in her mind. "Sometimes I catch him looking at you when you're not aware of it, as if he wants to say something but can't find the words." "Of course," she said, managing to keep her voice steady. "I understand how demanding your work is." They finished their breakfast in the silence that had become their normal state, but it felt different now, charged with unspoken possibilities and unexpressed longing. When Alexander rose to leave, gathering his papers with the efficient movements that marked everything he did, Evelyn found herself speaking before she could lose her nerve. "Alexander?" He paused at the doorway, his tall frame backlit by the morning sun streaming through the windows. "If you ever find yourself with an evening free, I would enjoy the company. For dinner, or perhaps just conversation. I feel as though we barely know each other, despite being married for 4 years." The statement hung between them like a confession, raw and honest, in a way that their relationship had never allowed. She watched as his grip tightened almost imperceptibly on his briefcase, as his jaw worked silently, as if he were wrestling with words that refused to be spoken. "I'll keep that in mind," he said finally, his voice so low she almost didn't hear it. And then he was gone, leaving her alone with the lingering scent of his cologne and the feeling that something fundamental had shifted between them, even if she couldn't yet define what it was. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Evelyn found herself unable to concentrate on her planned visit to the museum, unable to lose herself in books as she usually did, unable to do anything but replay the morning's conversation and analyze every word, every gesture, every fleeting expression that had crossed Alexander's face. She walked the length of the apartment countless times, her heels clicking against the marble floors in a rhythm that matched the restless beating of her heart. Mrs. Hartwell observed her unusual agitation with knowing eyes, but said nothing until late afternoon, when she found Evelyn standing once again at the living room windows, staring out at the city without really seeing it. "He'll be home earlier tonight," the housekeeper said without preamble. "Cancelled his dinner meeting, asked me to tell cook to prepare dinner for 2. Evelyn's heart leaped, then plummeted just as quickly. Perhaps he's expecting a business associate. No, madam. He specifically said to set the table in the small dining room, 2 places, candles. Mrs. Hartwell's smile was gentle but significant. In 30 years, he's never asked for candles at dinner. The implications of this information sent Evelyn's mind reeling. Candles suggested intimacy, romance even, concepts that had been so foreign to their marriage that she hardly knew how to process them. Was it possible that her invitation that morning had affected him more than he had let on? Was it possible that he was finally ready to bridge the distance between them? She spent the remaining hours before his return in a state of nervous anticipation that reminded her of her teenage years, preparing for her first real date. She changed her dress twice, settled on a simple but elegant black number that was sophisticated without being too formal, too obviously calculated. She let her hair down from its usual chignon, allowing the auburn waves to fall softly around her shoulders in a way that she knew flattered her, but that she had never dared to wear in his presence. When she heard his key in the lock at exactly 7 o'clock, her heart was beating so rapidly that she feared it might be visible beneath the silk of her dress. She forced herself to remain in the library, to maintain some semblance of the composure that had been her armor for so many years, but every nerve in her body was attuned to his movements through the apartment. She heard him speak to Mrs. Hartwell, heard his footsteps pause outside the library door. For a moment she thought he might enter, might finally cross the threshold into her sanctuary, but instead she heard him continue down the hallway toward his bedroom. The sound of running water suggested he was showering, and she found herself imagining things that a wife of 4 years should have been intimately familiar with, but that remained as mysterious to her as if they had never met. When Mrs. Hartwell knocked softly on the library door to announce that dinner was served, Evelyn's hands were trembling so violently that she had to clasp them together to still them. She made her way to the small dining room, a space they had never shared, which was usually reserved for her solitary meals, and found it transformed. The table, which usually seemed stark and utilitarian, despite its obvious quality, was now set with the finest china and crystal. 2 tall candles flickered in silver holders, casting dancing shadows on the walls and filling the room with a warm, golden light that was utterly different from the harsh overhead lighting that usually illuminated their interactions. Fresh flowers, white roses and baby's breath adorned the center of the table, their fragrance mingling with the subtle scents of the candles to create an atmosphere that spoke of celebration, of new beginnings. Alexander was already standing by his chair, and the sight of him made her breath catch in her throat. He had changed from his usual business attire into dark slacks and a white shirt, open at the collar, more casual than she had ever seen him and somehow more approachable. The candlelight played across his features, softening the harsh lines of his face and making him appear younger, less forbidding. Evelyn. He moved to pull out her chair, a gesture of courtesy that should have been commonplace between husband and wife, but that felt revolutionary given the distance that had always existed between them. His hand brushed her shoulder as she sat, the first deliberate physical contact between them in their entire marriage, and she felt the touch burn through the silk of her dress like a brand. "This is lovely," she managed to say, though her voice came out breathier than she intended. "Thank you. I thought, that is, you mentioned wanting to have dinner together, to talk." He took his own seat across from her, and she was struck by how different the small table made everything feel. Instead of the vast expanse of the main dining room, they were close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, could observe the way his throat moved when he swallowed what might have been nervousness. The meal was served with Mrs. Hartwell's usual efficiency, but Evelyn was barely aware of the food. Her entire attention was focused on the man across from her, on the way the candlelight caught in his hair, on the careful way he chose his words, as if each one were being weighed for its potential to either build or destroy the fragile thing that was growing between them. "You asked if we might talk," he said when they were halfway through the main course, his voice carrying a formality that couldn't quite hide an underlying tension. What would you like to discuss? It was such a careful question, so perfectly neutral, and yet she could sense the deeper invitation beneath it. He was offering her an opening, perhaps the only one she would ever get. She set down her fork and looked directly at him, summoning the courage she had been gathering all day. "I would like to know who you are," she said simply. "Beyond the businessman, beyond the public figure, I would like to know the man I married." Something flickered in his expression, surprise perhaps, or fear. "I'm not sure there's much to know beyond what you see." "I don't believe that." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, warmed by a conviction that surprised her. "No one becomes as successful as you are without passion, without driving forces beyond mere ambition. No one chooses the books you have in your study. I've seen them, Alexander, the poetry, the philosophy, without having depths that go far beyond financial reports and merger agreements." He was quiet for so long that she began to fear she had overstepped, had pushed too hard, too fast. But when he finally spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability she had never heard from him before. "My father believed that emotion was weakness," he said, his eyes fixed on his wineglass rather than meeting her gaze. "That attachment made a man vulnerable to manipulation, to failure. He built his empire by trusting no one completely, by keeping everyone at a distance. It was a successful philosophy from a business perspective. And from a personal perspective, he died alone." The words were spoken so quietly she almost missed them. Surrounded by wealth, by success, by everything he had worked to achieve, but alone. Evelyn felt her heart constrict at the pain hidden beneath his matter-of-fact tone. "Is that what you want? To die alone?" Finally he looked at her, and in his eyes she saw a longing so deep, so carefully buried, that it took her breath away. "I don't know how to want anything else. I don't know how to be anything other than what he made me." The confession hung between them, like a bridge finally built across the chasm that had separated them. Evelyn reached across the small table, her fingers touching his hand where it rested beside his wineglass. He didn't pull away, but she felt him tense at the contact, as if he were fighting every instinct his father had instilled in him. "You could learn," she said softly. "We could learn together. We're still young, Alexander. It's not too late for us to become more than just two people who happen to share a name and an address." His hand turned beneath hers, his fingers interlacing with hers in a grip that was almost desperate in its intensity. "I don't know how to be a husband, Evelyn. I don't know how to be anything more than what I am." "Then we'll figure it out together," she repeated, her thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of his hand. "One day at a time, one conversation at a time." They sat in silence for several minutes. Hands joined across the small table, candles flickering around them, both afraid to break the spell that had finally brought them together after 4 years of careful distance. When Alexander finally spoke again, his voice was rough with emotion he was no longer trying to hide. "I've watched you," he admitted, "from the beginning. The way you move through the world with such grace, such kindness to everyone around you. The way you read in the library, completely absorbed, completely yourself. The way you smile at Mrs. Hartwell, at the doorman, at strangers in the street. You have this capacity for warmth, for genuine feeling, that I've never understood, but that I've—" He paused, searching for words. "That I've envied, desperately." "You don't have to envy it," she said, her voice thick with tears she didn't try to hide. "You could share it, if you wanted to." "I want to." The admission seemed torn from him, as if it had been locked away for so long that releasing it was painful. "God help me, Evelyn. I want to more than I've ever wanted anything, but I don't know how to begin." "We've already begun," she said, lifting their joined hands and pressing a soft kiss to his knuckles. The gesture was gentle, almost chaste, but she felt him shudder at the contact, saw his eyes darken with something that might have been desire or simply the overwhelming relief of finally being touched with tenderness. The evening that followed was unlike anything either of them had experienced in their 4 years of marriage. They talked until the candles burned low, sharing stories from their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. Alexander spoke of the pressure to live up to his father's legacy, of the loneliness that had driven him to build walls around his heart. Evelyn shared her own fears, of never being good enough, of being valued only for her appearance and social connections, of spending her life in beautiful cages, surrounded by everything except the one thing she truly wanted: genuine human connection. When they finally made their way upstairs, they paused outside their separate bedrooms, an arrangement that had never been questioned in all their years together, but that now seemed like an insurmountable barrier. Alexander's hand still held hers, and neither seemed willing to let go first. "Evelyn," he said, her name a question and a prayer combined. "Yes," she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Tomorrow," he said finally, "perhaps we could have breakfast together again. And maybe you could show me that exhibition at the museum." The smile that spread across her face was radiant, transforming her from the composed society wife she had trained herself to be into the vibrant woman she had buried beneath years of disappointment and resignation. "I would love that," she said. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm that sent electricity shooting up her arm and straight to her heart. "Good night, Evelyn. Good night, Alexander." As she lay in her bed that night, staring up at the ceiling with a smile she couldn't suppress, Evelyn felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope for the future. Not the desperate, grasping hope that had sustained her through the early days of their marriage, but something deeper and more solid, the hope that came from finally being seen, finally being known by the man she had begun to love, despite herself. In his room across the hall, Alexander lay awake as well, his hand still tingling from the softness of her kiss, his mind reeling with the possibilities that had opened before them. For the first time in his adult life, he allowed himself to imagine a future that was about more than mere success, more than the accumulation of wealth and power. He allowed himself to imagine happiness. And for the first time, that happiness had a face and a name, and it was sleeping just across the hall from him. The morning, when it came, would bring new possibilities, new chances to build something real from the foundation they had finally begun to lay. But for now, it was enough to know that they were no longer alone in their separate silences. They were finally, truly together in the most important way of all. The weeks that followed their candlelit dinner passed like pages from a story Evelyn had never dared to hope she might live. Each morning brought small revelations, tiny breaches in the fortress Alexander had built around his heart, and with each passing day, she felt herself falling more deeply in love with the man she was finally beginning to know. Their breakfast conversations became a cherished ritual, replacing the solitary meals that had defined their marriage for 4 years. Alexander would arrive at the table with his usual punctuality, but now his eyes would seek hers immediately, and the formal "good morning" had evolved into something warmer, more intimate. He had begun to ask about her plans for the day, to listen with genuine interest as she spoke of her reading, her charitable work, the small details of her life that had previously seemed too insignificant to share. The museum visit had been a revelation in itself. Evelyn had watched in fascination as Alexander stood before the pre-Raphaelite paintings, his dark eyes studying each brushstroke with an intensity that spoke of genuine appreciation for beauty. When she had commented on the tragic love story depicted in one of the paintings, he had turned to her with an expression that made her breath catch. "Do you believe in that kind of love?" he had asked, his voice so low that she had to step closer to hear him, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "The kind that consumes everything else?" "I used to," she had answered honestly, "before I learned to protect myself from wanting impossible things." His eyes had searched her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed, vulnerable. "Perhaps some things that seem impossible are merely delayed." The words had haunted her for days afterward, carrying implications that she hardly dared to examine too closely. Was he speaking of love in general, or of their own situation? Was it possible that the man who had maintained such careful distance for 4 years was finally allowing himself to feel something deeper than duty and obligation? The evidence accumulated slowly, like drops of water wearing away stone. Alexander had begun to linger after breakfast, sometimes walking with her to the library and running his fingers along the spines of books he had never previously acknowledged. He had started coming home earlier from work, joining her for dinner more often than not, though they still maintained the careful distance that seemed to be an integral part of who he was. But it was the small gestures that spoke most loudly of the changes taking place beneath the surface of their carefully maintained routine. The morning she had found a rare first edition of Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South on her bedside table, with a note in his precise handwriting. "I thought you might enjoy this. The heroine reminded me of someone I know." The evening he had appeared in the library doorway, with 2 glasses of wine, asking if he might join her for a few minutes before retiring. The way his eyes followed her movements when he thought she wasn't looking, with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. Most significantly, there had been the gradual dissolution of the physical barriers that had defined their relationship. It had begun with small things, his hand touching hers as he helped her from a car, his palm pressed briefly against the small of her back as he guided her through a crowded room at a charity function. But each touch lingered a little longer than necessary, carried a weight that spoke of carefully controlled desire rather than mere courtesy. The breakthrough came on a rain-soaked Thursday evening in March. Evelyn had been in the library, curled in her usual chair with a cup of tea and a novel, when a particularly violent clap of thunder had shaken the windows and caused the lights to flicker ominously. She had always harbored a secret fear of thunderstorms, a childhood phobia she had never quite overcome, and despite her best efforts to remain composed, she found herself trembling as the storm intensified. Alexander appeared in the doorway, as if summoned by her distress, his shirt sleeves rolled up from working in his study, his dark hair slightly disheveled in a way that made him appear younger, more approachable. "Are you all right?" he asked, and she realized that her fear must have been written clearly on her face. "I'm fine," she began automatically, but another crash of thunder made her flinch involuntarily, and the lie died on her lips. Without a word, he crossed the room and settled beside her on the small sofa near the fireplace, the first time he had ever joined her in her sanctuary. His presence was overwhelming, the scent of his cologne mingling with the smell of old books and rain. But it was also profoundly comforting. When the next flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed immediately by thunder so loud it seemed to shake the building's foundations, she found herself instinctively reaching for him. His arms came around her without hesitation, pulling her against his chest with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. She could feel the rapid beating of his heart beneath her cheek, could hear the way his breathing changed as she settled more fully against him. His hand stroked her hair with a gentleness that spoke of carefully leashed emotion, as if he were afraid that too much feeling might frighten her away. "I have you," he murmured against the top of her head, his voice rough with something she didn't dare name. "You're safe." They remained like that throughout the storm, her body curved against his arms encircling her like a shield against everything that might threaten her peace. She felt him gradually relax as the thunder moved farther away, felt the tension leave his muscles as he allowed himself this moment of unguarded intimacy. When she finally looked up at him, his eyes were dark with an emotion that made her pulse race. "Evelyn," he said, her name barely more than a whisper. His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheekbone with a reverence that made her feel cherished in a way she had never experienced. Whatever he had been about to say was lost as she lifted her face to his, closing the distance between them in a kiss that was tentative at first, questioning, but that deepened as he responded with a hunger that spoke of 4 years of careful restraint finally breaking down. His lips were warm and firm against hers, his kiss carrying a desperation that matched her own, as if they were both drowning and had finally found air. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she saw something in his expression that made her heart soar. Vulnerability, yes, but also a tenderness that transformed his austere features into something beautiful. His forehead rested against hers, his eyes closed as if he were savoring the moment. "I've wanted to do that since the day we were married," he confessed, his voice so low she almost didn't hear it. "But I was afraid." Afraid of what? Afraid that if I allowed myself to feel anything for you, I would lose control entirely. Afraid that I would want too much, need too much. My father always said that desire was the enemy of success, that caring for someone gave them power over you that could destroy everything you'd built. Evelyn's heart ached for the young man who had been taught that love was weakness, that caring was dangerous. "What do you think now?" He opened his eyes, meeting her gaze with an intensity that made her feel as if he could see into her very soul. "Now, I think that what I've built means nothing if I have no one to share it with. Now I think that the only thing worse than being vulnerable is being alone." The words hung between them like a promise, like the first lines of a poem that was only beginning to be written. When he kissed her again, it was with a reverence that spoke of wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe that she was real, that she was his, that after 4 years of careful distance they had finally found their way to each other. The days that followed brought a transformation that was visible to everyone in their orbit. Mrs. Hartwell smiled more often, humming as she went about her duties, clearly delighted by the change in the atmosphere of the apartment. The staff at Alexander's office began to comment on his improved mood, his increased patience with minor frustrations that would previously have earned sharp rebukes. Even the society photographers began to notice the difference when they appeared together at public functions, the way Alexander's hand lingered at Evelyn's waist, the way their eyes met across crowded rooms, the genuine warmth in their smiles when they looked at each other. But it was the private moments that truly revealed the depth of the change taking place between them. Alexander had begun to seek her out in the evenings, not with the formal politeness that had characterized their previous interactions, but with a hunger for her company that he no longer tried to hide. He would find excuses to touch her, adjusting a strand of her hair, taking her hand to examine a ring she was wearing, steadying her with a hand on her back that lingered longer than necessary. The physical attraction that had always simmered beneath the surface of their relationship, carefully suppressed and politely ignored, had blossomed into something that charged the air between them with electricity. Evelyn found herself hyper-aware of his presence, of the way his shirt stretched across his broad shoulders, of the way his eyes darkened when he looked at her, of the controlled grace with which he moved through their shared spaces. Yet for all the progress they had made, there remained barriers between them that neither seemed ready to fully breach. They still maintained separate bedrooms, still observed the careful proprieties that had governed their marriage from the beginning. The kisses they shared were passionate but brief, always ending before they could lead to the kind of intimacy that would truly make them husband and wife in every sense of the word. The tension was becoming unbearable, a constant hum of desire and frustration that colored every interaction. Evelyn would catch herself staring at his hands and wondering what they would feel like on her skin, would find her thoughts drifting during conversations to imagine what it would be like to wake up in his arms. The nights were the worst, lying alone in her bed, knowing he was just across the hall, separated by nothing more than convention and the fear of pushing too fast, too far. The resolution came, inevitably, from an unexpected source. Evelyn's sister Caroline had called with news that she would be in New York for a weekend, wanting to meet the mysterious husband who had kept Evelyn so secluded from her family. The prospect of introducing Alexander to Caroline filled Evelyn with a mixture of excitement and terror. Her sister was perceptive, warm, and utterly without the social filters that governed Evelyn's world. If anyone could see through the carefully maintained facade of their marriage, it would be Caroline. She's very direct, Evelyn warned Alexander as they prepared for Caroline's arrival. She doesn't understand the kind of formal arrangements that are common in our social circle. Alexander paused in adjusting his tie, meeting her eyes in the mirror. Are you concerned that she'll realize our marriage hasn't been unconventional? The careful euphemism hung between them, acknowledging without quite stating the fundamental truth of their relationship. I'm concerned that she'll ask questions I'm not sure how to answer. He turned to face her fully, his expression serious. What would you like me to tell her? About us, I mean. About what we are to each other. It was a fair question, but one that touched on the very heart of their evolving relationship. What were they to each other? More than they had been 6 months ago, certainly, but less than she wanted them to be. The careful balance they had achieved was precious but incomplete, and the prospect of having to define it for someone else forced them to confront the limitations they had both been content to ignore. I would like you to tell her the truth, she said finally, whatever that is. His smile was soft, transforming his features in the way that never failed to make her heart skip. The truth is that I'm a man who is falling in love with his wife, despite 4 years of trying to convince himself that such feelings were dangerous luxuries he couldn't afford. The words hung in the air like a gift, like a promise, like the answer to prayers she hadn't dared to voice. And I'm a woman who stopped believing in love until her husband reminded her what it felt like to hope. When Caroline arrived that evening, effervescent and curious and utterly charmed by Alexander's careful courtesy, Evelyn watched with fascination as her husband navigated the social dynamics of her family with the same skill he brought to his business dealings. But there were moments throughout the dinner when she caught her sister studying them both with knowing eyes, taking in the way Alexander's attention never strayed far from Evelyn, the way his hand sought hers across the table, the electricity that crackled between them even in casual conversation. "You're happy," Caroline said later, when she and Evelyn were alone in the kitchen while Alexander took a business call. It wasn't a question, but an observation, spoken with the satisfaction of someone who had worried about a loved one for a long time. "I am," Evelyn replied, and realized as she spoke the words that they were true in a way they hadn't been for years. "It took us a while to find our way to each other, but we did. He looks at you like you hung the moon," Caroline continued with characteristic directness, "and you look at him like you want to devour him." The blunt assessment made Evelyn blush, but she didn't deny it. "It's complicated. We've been married for 4 years, but in many ways we're just beginning to know each other." Caroline's expression softened with understanding. "Sometimes the best love stories are the ones that take time to unfold. Sometimes people need to grow into each other." When Alexander returned from his call, he found the two sisters talking quietly, and something in Evelyn's expression must have conveyed the substance of their conversation, because his eyes darkened with an emotion she was beginning to recognize. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of wine and laughter, and the kind of easy domesticity that Evelyn had never imagined could exist in their formal apartment. But it was after Caroline retired to the guest room that the real moment of truth arrived. Alexander and Evelyn found themselves alone in the living room, the city lights twinkling beyond the windows, the air between them charged with the same electricity that had been building for weeks, when he reached for her, pulling her into his arms with a desperation that spoke of barely controlled desire. She went willingly, eagerly, ready finally to cross the last barriers that separated them. "Evelyn," he said against her lips, her name a prayer and a plea combined. I don't want to wait anymore. I want you to be my wife in every sense of the word." "Yes," she whispered, the single word containing 4 years of longing and hope and love finally given voice. "Yes, Alexander, please." Dadi, when he lifted her in his arms and carried her toward the stairs, toward his bedroom, toward the future they were finally ready to claim together, Evelyn felt as if she were being carried not just across the apartment, but across the chasm that had separated them for so long. In his eyes, she saw the same wonder that filled her own heart, the same amazement that love had found them despite everything that had stood in its way. The man who had spent 4 years avoiding her touch was about to make her truly his wife, and the woman who had given up on love was about to discover what it meant to be completely, utterly cherished. The night that lay ahead would transform them both, would bridge the final gap between the strangers they had been and the lovers they were destined to become. As Alexander's bedroom door closed behind them, Evelyn knew that they were finally ready to claim what had been theirs by right from the beginning. Not just a marriage in name, but a true union of hearts, minds, and bodies that would make them whole at last. The morning light that filtered through Alexander's bedroom windows fell upon a scene that would have been unthinkable just weeks before. Evelyn lay curled against her husband's chest, her auburn hair spread across his shoulder like spilled silk, her breathing soft and even in the peaceful rhythm of true rest. For the first time in 4 years of marriage, she had awakened in her husband's arms, and the rightness of it filled her with a contentment so profound it seemed to reach into her very soul. Alexander was already awake, had been for some time, she suspected, though he remained perfectly still as if afraid that any movement might disturb the miracle of her presence beside him. His dark eyes, when she finally lifted her head to meet them, held a vulnerability she had never seen before, as if the passionate hours they had shared had stripped away the last of his carefully constructed defenses. "Good morning, husband," she whispered, the word carrying a weight and meaning it had never possessed before. They had been legally married for 4 years, but only now did she feel truly wed to him, bound not merely by ceremony and contract, but by the deepest intimacy two people could share. "Good morning, wife," he replied, his voice rough with sleep and emotion. His hand came up to cup her face with a tenderness that made her heart flutter, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek as if he were memorizing her features. "I was beginning to think I might have dreamed all of this." She pressed a kiss to his palm, tasting salt and the lingering scent of his cologne. "If it was a dream, then we shared it, and I have no desire to wake up." The night that had passed between them had been a revelation in every sense. Alexander had been a lover of surprising passion and infinite patience, worshipping her body with a reverence that spoke of 4 years of suppressed longing finally given free rein. Every touch had been deliberate, every caress designed to bring her pleasure, every whispered endearment a promise of devotion that went far beyond physical desire. But it had been more than mere passion that had transformed them both. In the darkness of his bedroom, with the city lights painting patterns on the walls around them, they had finally shed the last pretenses that had kept them apart. Alexander had spoken of his fears, his loneliness, the crushing weight of expectations that had shaped him into a man who trusted no one completely. Evelyn had shared her own struggles, the years of feeling invisible despite being constantly observed, of wondering if anyone would ever see past her social role to the woman beneath. Now, in the gentle light of dawn, they were no longer the same people who had maintained such careful distance for 4 years. They had been reborn in each other's arms, transformed by the simple but revolutionary act of allowing themselves to be completely known and completely accepted by another human being. "What happens now?" Evelyn asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. This was not merely a night of passion that would fade with the morning light. It was the beginning of the life they should have been living all along. "Now we learn what it means to truly be married," Alexander said, his arms tightening around her as if he could hold onto this moment forever. "Now we discover what we could have been if we hadn't been so afraid of feeling too much." The weeks that followed were a honeymoon period that neither had experienced during their actual honeymoon 4 years earlier. That stiff, formal affair that had been more photo opportunity than romantic getaway. This time, their romance unfolded in the spaces they had always shared, but never truly inhabited together. The apartment that had once felt like a museum became a home, filled with laughter and conversation and the comfortable silences of two people who no longer felt the need to maintain perfect composure in each other's presence. Alexander began working from home more often, conducting meetings from his study, while Evelyn read in the library, both of them finding excuses to seek each other out throughout the day. Their lunch hours became stolen moments of intimacy. Their evening dinners transformed from polite exchanges into genuine conversations about everything and nothing. The formal distance that had characterized their public appearances gave way to a warmth that was impossible to hide, and the society photographers who had once captured them looking like elegant strangers now found them exchanging glances that spoke of private jokes and shared secrets. Mrs. Hartwell, who had watched their transformation with undisguised delight, began to hum while she worked, clearly pleased to finally be presiding over a household where the master and mistress actually seemed to enjoy each other's company. The other staff members, who had grown accustomed to navigating the careful protocols of a marriage that was more business arrangement than love match, gradually relaxed into the easier rhythms of a home where affection was openly displayed. But perhaps the most significant change was in Alexander himself. The man who had been shaped by his father's belief that emotion was weakness began to discover the strength that came from allowing himself to feel deeply. He laughed more often, smiled with genuine warmth rather than practiced courtesy, and began to show interest in aspects of life beyond the accumulation of wealth and power. When Evelyn mentioned her volunteer work at a local literacy center, he surprised her by asking if he might join her, contributing not just funding, but his own time to help adults learn to read. "I want to understand the things that matter to you," he explained when she expressed amazement at his involvement. "I want to be part of your world, not just have you exist in mine." It was a sentiment that perfectly encapsulated the fundamental shift in their relationship. Where once he had expected her to orbit around his life like a decorative satellite, now he was actively seeking ways to weave their lives together into a true partnership. He began asking her opinion about business decisions, not out of politeness, but because he genuinely valued her perspective. He started planning their social calendar around events he thought she would enjoy, rather than simply expecting her to accompany him to whatever functions served his professional interests. The physical intimacy that had been missing from their marriage for 4 years became a constant undercurrent to their daily life. Alexander seemed unable to be in the same room with her without touching her in some way, a hand on her shoulder as he passed behind her chair, his fingers intertwining with hers as they walked, kisses that began as brief greetings and lingered until they were both breathless with desire. Their separate bedrooms became a relic of the past as Evelyn moved her belongings into the master suite, claiming her rightful place not just in his bed, but in every aspect of his life. Yet even in their happiness, there were moments when the shadows of their past threatened to intrude. Alexander would sometimes catch himself withdrawing into old patterns of emotional distance, particularly when work pressures mounted or when they were in social situations that reminded him of his father's teachings about the dangers of appearing too attached. During these times, Evelyn had learned to be patient but persistent, gently drawing him back to her with touches and words that reminded him of who they had become together. "You're thinking too much," she would tell him when she saw the familiar tension creep into his shoulders, the careful control that spoke of walls being rebuilt. "Come back to me." And he would, always, because the man who had once believed that isolation was safety had discovered that true security lay in the arms of someone who loved him, not despite his vulnerabilities, but because of his willingness to share them with her. The true test of their transformed relationship came with the announcement that Alexander's business partner, Marcus Wellington, would be hosting a major charity gala that would bring together the most prominent figures from their social and business circles. It was exactly the kind of event that had once been torture for both of them. Alexander forced to play the role of the devoted husband while maintaining his emotional distance. Evelyn required to smile and make polite conversation while feeling utterly alone despite being surrounded by people. "We don't have to go," Alexander said when the invitation arrived, his protective instincts immediately engaged. "I can send our regrets, make some excuse about work commitments. But Evelyn, who had once dreaded such occasions, found herself looking forward to this one with anticipation rather than resignation. "I want to go," she said, surprising them both. "I want to show the world what we've become." The night of the gala, as they dressed in the master bedroom they now shared, Evelyn caught sight of their reflection in the full-length mirror and was struck by how different they looked together. Where once they had appeared to be two separate people who happened to be wearing matching wedding rings, now they moved with the unconscious synchronization of true partners. Alexander, adjusting his bow tie, caught her watching him in the mirror and smiled with a warmth that transformed his austere features. "You're beautiful," he said, coming to stand behind her, his hands settling on her waist as he pressed a kiss to her bare shoulder. "But more than that, you're radiant. You're glowing with happiness, and it takes my breath away." She leaned back against his chest, marveling at how natural it felt to accept his embrace, to bask in his admiration. The woman in the mirror bore little resemblance to the carefully composed society wife who had attended such events for 4 years. This woman's eyes sparkled with genuine joy. Her smile was warm and unguarded, and most importantly, she was looking at her husband as if he were the most fascinating man in the world, which to her he absolutely was. The gala itself proved to be a triumph in ways neither of them had anticipated. Where once they had moved through such events like actors playing their parts, now their affection was so genuine, so unmistakable, that it became the subject of whispered conversations throughout the ballroom. People who had known them for years commented on the change, on the way Alexander's eyes followed Evelyn across the room, on the protective way he kept her close to his side, on the intimate smiles they exchanged during conversations with others. "Whatever you're doing differently, it's working," Carolyn had said when she called the next week, having seen photos from the event in the society pages. "You both look like you're about to float away on a cloud of happiness." And indeed, that was exactly how Evelyn felt, weightless with joy, anchored only by Alexander's love and her own growing certainty that they had finally found their way to the life they were meant to share. The man, who had once seemed as distant as a star, had become the center of her universe, just as she had somehow become the center of his. The changes in their relationship rippled outward into every aspect of their lives. Alexander began delegating more responsibilities at work, carving out time for the personal life he had never allowed himself to prioritize. Evelyn started taking on more significant roles in her charitable work, her confidence bolstered by her husband's unwavering support and genuine interest in her contributions. They began making plans for the future, travel they wanted to do together, causes they wanted to support as a team, even tentative discussions about the family they might one day create. But perhaps the most significant change was the way they had learned to navigate the inevitable challenges that arose in any marriage. When disagreements occurred, and they did, as they learned each other's rhythms and preferences, they no longer retreated into polite distance. Instead, they had developed the ability to argue constructively, to express their feelings openly and work together toward resolution. The communication skills they had been forced to develop during their courtship served them well in married life, allowing them to address problems before they could fester into resentment. One evening in late spring, as they sat together on the terrace overlooking Central Park, Alexander reached for Evelyn's hand with the same sense of wonder that had characterized his touch since the night they had first truly become husband and wife. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we had never found our way to each other?" he asked, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm. "If we had continued as we were for the next 40 years, Evelyn considered the question seriously, imagining a life of continued polite distance, of separate bedrooms, and careful conversations, and all the small tragedies of a marriage that existed only on paper. "I think we would have slowly disappeared," she said finally. "Not physically, but the people we really are would have been buried so deeply under all that careful courtesy that eventually they would have ceased to exist at all. And now?" She turned to face him fully, her free hand coming up to trace the strong line of his jaw. "Now I feel more myself than I ever have. You make me braver, Alexander. You make me want to be the best version of who I could be. You saved me," he said simply, "from becoming my father, from living his life of beautiful, terrible isolation. You taught me that strength doesn't come from standing alone. It comes from choosing to stand with someone who sees all your flaws and loves you anyway." As the sun set over the city they called home, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that rivaled any masterpiece, Evelyn reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 4 years of marriage had finally taught them what it meant to be married, and the lesson had been worth every moment of pain and loneliness that had preceded it. They were no longer two people pretending to be one. They had become one in the truest sense, their individual strengths and weaknesses combining to create something stronger and more beautiful than either could have achieved alone. The future stretched before them bright with possibility, and for the first time since their wedding day, they were eager to discover what it might hold. The night air grew cool around them, but neither moved to go inside. They had spent too many evenings apart, too many nights in separate silences. Now they treasured every moment of connection, every opportunity to simply exist together in perfect contentment. The city lights began to twinkle below them like earthbound stars, and Evelyn thought that this quiet moment of absolute happiness was worth every day of loneliness she had endured to reach it. Alexander's arms came around her, pulling her close against his chest, and she could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her cheek. It was a sound she had learned to depend on, a constant reminder that she was no longer alone in the world. Whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together as true partners in every sense of the word. The millionaire who had once believed that love was a luxury he couldn't afford had finally claimed what was his. Not through force or demand, but through the patient cultivation of trust and tenderness. And the woman who had given up on love had discovered that sometimes the greatest romances were not the ones that began with passion, but the ones that grew slowly, carefully, deliberately into something that could weather any storm. They were no longer strangers sharing a name. They were husband and wife in the deepest, truest sense of those words, and the night air around them seemed to shimmer with the promise of all the tomorrows they would share. 2 years had passed since that transformative night when Alexander had finally claimed his wife in every sense of the word, and the penthouse that had once felt like a mausoleum now pulsed with the vibrant energy of a life truly lived. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating not the sterile perfection that had once characterized the space, but the beautiful chaos of a home where love had been allowed to flourish. Evelyn's books now mingled freely with Alexander's business journals on every available surface, their reading habits having converged in the comfortable way of couples who had learned to share not just space, but thoughts and dreams. Fresh flowers, no longer the formal arrangements chosen by decorators, but wildly romantic bouquets that Alexander had taken to bringing home without occasion, filled every room with color and fragrance. Photographs lined the mantelpiece and side tables, capturing moments from their travels together. Alexander laughing with unguarded joy on a beach in Tuscany, Evelyn radiant in a sundress as she fed pigeons in a Parisian square, both of them beaming as they danced at their friend's wedding, finally looking like the love-struck couple the world had always assumed them to be. But the most significant change was not in their surroundings, but in themselves. Alexander, who had once moved through life with the controlled precision of a man afraid to display any vulnerability, now carried himself with the relaxed confidence of someone who had nothing left to hide. His success in business had not diminished. If anything, his increased happiness had made him more decisive, more innovative, more willing to take calculated risks. But it was no longer the sole measure of his worth in his own eyes. Evelyn, meanwhile, had blossomed into a woman of substance, whose influence extended far beyond the society pages. Her literacy work had expanded into a full non-profit organization, and her genuine passion for helping others had made her a sought-after speaker and advocate. The shy, overlooked wife, who had once felt like a beautiful accessory, had become a force in her own right, her husband's equal partner in every meaningful way. This morning, however, carried a significance that neither the bustling city below nor the casual observer could have detected. Evelyn stood once again at the window where this story had begun, but her reflection now showed a woman transformed not just by love, but by the secret she carried, a secret that would complete their journey from strangers to lovers to something even more profound. Alexander found her there, just as he had found her on countless mornings over the past 6 years, but his approach was entirely different now. Instead of the careful distance that had once characterized his every movement around her, he came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest with the easy familiarity of a man who had claimed every right to touch and hold the woman he loved. "You're up early," he murmured against her hair, his voice still rough with sleep but warm with affection. "I missed you in bed." She leaned into his embrace, marveling as she always did at the solid strength of him, at the way her body fit perfectly against his, as if they had been designed specifically for each other. "I couldn't sleep. Too much to think about." Something in her tone made him tighten his arms around her, his protective instincts immediately engaged. "What kind of thoughts? Pleasant ones, I hope." She turned in his arms, studying his face in the morning light. At 34, he was even more handsome than he had been when they married, the lines around his eyes now speaking of laughter rather than stress, his mouth soft with the kind of contentment that came from being deeply loved and loving deeply in return. The harsh edges that his father's training had carved into his features had been smoothed away by happiness, revealing the man he had always been beneath the armor of control and distance. "Alexander," she said, reaching up to trace the strong line of his jaw, "what would you say if I told you that our family is about to grow?" For a moment he didn't comprehend her meaning, his dark eyes searching her face with confusion. Then understanding dawned, and she watched as every emotion she could have hoped for played across his features: surprise, wonder, joy, and finally a tenderness so profound it took her breath away. "Are you—" He couldn't seem to finish the question, his hands moving to her waist as if he could already detect the changes taking place within her. "Yes," she whispered, tears of happiness spilling down her cheeks. "We're going to have a baby, Alexander. You're going to be a father." The kiss he gave her was unlike any they had shared before. Desperate with gratitude, fierce with possessive joy, tender with a love that had grown far beyond anything either of them had thought possible. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "How long have you known?" "I suspected for a few weeks, but I wanted to be certain before I told you. I saw the doctor yesterday." She pressed her palm against his cheek, feeling the slight tremor in his jaw that betrayed the depth of his emotion. "Are you happy?" "Happy?" He laughed, the sound rich with wonder. "Evelyn, I don't have words for what I am. Terrified, certainly. Amazed, grateful beyond measure." His hand settled protectively over her still flat stomach. "A baby. Our baby." The days that followed were a whirlwind of preparations and revelations as they adjusted to the reality of impending parenthood. Alexander, who had approached every challenge in his life with methodical precision, threw himself into pregnancy research with the same intensity he had once reserved for corporate acquisitions. The man who had once feared any display of emotion now spoke openly about his hopes and concerns for their child, sharing memories of his own lonely childhood and his determination to provide their son or daughter with the love and attention he had been denied. "I want our child to know they are wanted," he said one evening, as they sat in what would soon become the nursery, his hand resting on Evelyn's growing belly. "I want them to never doubt for a single moment that they are the most important thing in our world." "They will," Evelyn assured him, covering his hand with hers. "They'll have what we never had. Parents who love each other as much as they love their child." The observation was more profound than either of them had initially realized. In healing their own relationship, in learning to love each other completely, they had created the foundation for the kind of family that could nurture and sustain a child through all the challenges of growing up. Their baby would be born not into the careful distance that had characterized the early years of their marriage, but into the warm, secure environment of a home where love was freely expressed and genuine partnership was the norm. As Evelyn's pregnancy progressed, their friends and colleagues marveled at the continued transformation in both of them. Alexander, who had once been notorious for his single-minded focus on business, now left the office at reasonable hours and declined evening engagements that would keep him away from his wife. He attended every doctor's appointment, asked questions with the intensity of a man whose entire world now revolved around the health and happiness of his growing family. Evelyn, meanwhile, had never been more radiant. Pregnancy suited her, bringing a glow to her skin and a serenity to her manner that spoke of deep contentment. But more than the physical changes, there was an inner transformation that was evident to everyone who knew her. The woman who had once seemed to apologize for her very existence now moved through the world with quiet confidence, secure in her role as Alexander's beloved wife and the mother of their child. The nursery they created together became a symbol of everything their relationship had become, a perfect blend of both their personalities, practical but beautiful, filled with love and hope for the future. Alexander insisted on painting it himself, despite his complete lack of experience with such domestic tasks, because he wanted their child's room to be shaped by his own hands. Evelyn spent hours selecting each item with care, wanting everything to be perfect for the little person who would soon complete their family. But perhaps the most significant moment came one evening in her 7th month as they attended the same charity gala where they had first appeared as a truly united couple. This time, however, Evelyn's condition was unmistakable, and the sight of Alexander's protective attention to his visibly pregnant wife created a stir throughout the ballroom. "You can't stop touching her," Caroline observed with amusement when she joined them for a few minutes. "It's like you're afraid she might disappear if you're not physically connected to her at all times." Alexander had the grace to look slightly embarrassed, but he didn't move his hand from the small of Evelyn's back. "I suppose I am rather possessive," he admitted. "But can you blame me? Look at her. She's carrying my child, Caroline. She's giving me something I never even knew I wanted." The reverence in his voice, the way his eyes never left Evelyn's face as he spoke, would have been impossible to imagine from the distant, controlled man who had married her 6 years earlier. Love had not just changed him. It had revealed who he truly was beneath all the careful conditioning of his upbringing. The labor, when it finally came on a snow-laden December morning, was both the most frightening and most triumphant experience of their lives. Alexander, who had faced hostile boardrooms and ruthless competitors without flinching, found himself nearly paralyzed with terror at the thought of anything happening to Evelyn. But she, drawing on reserves of strength that amazed them both, brought their son into the world with a courage that left her husband in awe. When the doctor placed their baby in Alexander's arms for the first time, the transformation was complete. The man who had once believed that love was weakness wept openly as he looked down at his son, his large hands cradling the tiny body with infinite gentleness. The child, perfect and healthy and absolutely beautiful, looked up at his father with dark eyes that were already so much like Alexander's that it took Evelyn's breath away. "Hello, little one," Alexander whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm your father, and I love you more than I knew it was possible to love anything." Evelyn, exhausted but radiant with joy, watched as her husband fell completely, irrevocably in love with their son. The baby, as if recognizing something familiar in Alexander's voice, settled peacefully in his father's arms, tiny fingers grasping at the man who would spend the rest of his life, ensuring that his child never doubted for a moment that he was cherished. They named him James Alexander Thorne, after Alexander's grandfather, the one member of his family who had shown him genuine affection before his father's philosophy of emotional distance had taken hold. But from the moment he was born, he was simply Jamie to them, the missing piece they hadn't known they were waiting for. The early weeks of parenthood revealed new depths to their relationship as they learned to navigate the challenges and joys of caring for their son together. Alexander, who had once been afraid of his own capacity for feeling, proved to be a devoted father whose love for his child was matched only by his continued adoration of his wife. Evelyn watched in wonder as her husband, who had spent years believing himself incapable of nurturing anyone, instinctively knew how to comfort their baby, how to make him laugh, how to be exactly the kind of father their son needed. But it was in the quiet moments, the middle-of-the-night feedings when they worked as a team to care for their child, the afternoons when all three of them napped together on their bed, the evenings when they sat in the nursery watching Jamie sleep, that the true miracle of their transformation was most evident. They had become not just lovers, not just husband and wife, but a family in the deepest sense of the word. 1 year after Jamie's birth, as they celebrated their 7th wedding anniversary, Evelyn found herself once again at the window where this journey had begun. But now she held their son in her arms, while Alexander stood behind them both, his hands resting on her shoulders, his chin on top of her head. The city below remained the same, but everything else in their world had been transformed by the simple, revolutionary act of allowing themselves to love completely. "Do you remember," Alexander said quietly, "standing here that morning when you finally decided to stop accepting the distance between us, when you decided to fight for us? I remember being terrified," she admitted, shifting Jamie to her other hip as he babbled contentedly at the birds flying past the window. "I remember thinking that I would rather risk everything than continue living as strangers." "I'm glad you were brave," he said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I'm glad you saved us both." As they stood there together, husband, wife, and child, watching their city wake up to another day of infinite possibility, Evelyn reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect contentment. 4 long years of marriage without a single meaningful touch had nearly destroyed them both. But in learning to reach for each other, they had discovered something far more valuable than the fortune that had first brought them together. They had found love, real, deep, transformative love that had turned 2 lonely people into a family bound together by choice as much as by fate. The millionaire had finally taken what was his, not through force or demand, but through the patient cultivation of trust and tenderness. And in doing so, he had given his wife something infinitely more precious than wealth or status. He had given her a love that would last a lifetime and a family that would be their greatest achievement. The morning sun continued to stream through their windows, but now it illuminated not emptiness, but abundance. The abundance that came from hearts that had finally learned to open completely to each other. Whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them as they faced everything now, together with love, with the absolute certainty that they had found in each other exactly what they had been searching for all along. Their love story had taken 6 years to fully unfold, but as they stood there in the golden light of morning, with their son between them, they knew it was only the beginning of a lifetime of happiness that they had chosen to create together. The distance that had once separated them now seemed impossible to imagine, replaced by an intimacy so profound that they moved through life as two halves of one whole, perfectly matched and completely content in the love they had fought so hard to find.